Welcome to lesson 4. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the qualitative research, which is the counterpart to the quantitative research. Now, your research proposal will be focused on the quantitative data, but it's important to have a good understanding of what qualitative research is, and that's what we'll be talking about in this lesson. Here's just a tongue-in-cheek about what books that would be short if based on quantitative data. And the point of this is to show that there is a point to have qualitative data. So, um, looking at the mental health benefits of Snapchat or why everyone is mad about research methods, it's important. The point of this is, other than being a little attempt at humor, is the fact that there are important aspects that quantitative data can give a little more detail potentially and in-depth information that may not be you may not be able to get from quantitative data. So let's go ahead and let's move forward on what quantitative data is. So here's a good definition of what qualitative research is. And the goal of qualitative research is the development of concepts which help us to understand social phenomenon in natural rather than experimental settings, giving due emphasis to the meanings, experiences, and views of all the participants. So the idea here is it gives you a much richer, deeper understanding of what the person feels about something or views about something. And most qualitative research is prominent in sociology or anthropology and psychology, but is used in kinesiology-related fields in some ways. And the reason why qualitative research can provide some additional benefits is that data are non-numerical. So in other words, instead of trying to provide just on a scale of 1 to 5 about what their view of physical activity is, with qualitative research, you would allow them to, and through maybe a survey or a questionnaire or through a conversation, you would be able to provide more in-depth information from that individual to glean why they feel the way they do about the physical activity. So rather than in quantitative data where it's just a very straightforward numeric, the advantage of qualitative research, it allows you to go more in depth and more richer in terms of maybe the meaning of why people view things the way they do or doing the things the way they are doing them. Now, here are some types of qualitative research in kinesiology. The first is participant observation, where the researchers collect data on naturally occurring behaviors in the usual context or setting. An example would be if a researcher was viewing children at play and determining why children are playing the way they're playing or how they're playing the way they're playing. This gives, again, an idea of a little more richer aspect of why a population might be doing what they're doing, but in their natural environment, which allows them to continue to do what they normally would do, as opposed to if you brought them into a lab and it might alter what they would normally do. Another type of research is in-depth interviews, where you collect data on individuals' personal histories or perspectives and experiences. An example would be if you're trying to understand the viewpoints of a championship team, what the players thought contributed to their success. And so this would allow for the investigator to dive deeper into the meaning or the thought process of the athletes and the coaches to understand what they believe might have been the reason they were able to win a championship. The final qualitative research type is the focus groups, where an investigator will collect data on norms or beliefs of a group to generate broad overviews of issues of concern to the groups represented. So you would take a small group of 5 to 10 people and ask them particular questions about a particular topic, and then you would generalize that potentially to a larger population that's similar to them. Again, the focus group allows for that conversation back and forth, but again, it's on a particular group that you've identified to generate some broad overviews of those issues that might be affecting that population. Now, there's some main criticisms of qualitative research that people believe. One of which is that qualitative research is weaker or easier to do than quantitative research, and thereby doesn't give you the sound data and allows you to make an effective and positive decision about what the outcomes would be. And they also believe that some investigators believe that the truth can only be found in the numbers, the quantitative data. The numbers are the only way to really pinpoint an answer and determine an answer. However, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to do my best to help or discuss and address some of these criticisms as to some of the benefits that you might find actually in qualitative research. So there's a typical process for qualitative research. And the first is the investigator needs to define the research problem. Similar to quantitative data, there needs to be, it could be through observation or it could be through simple trial and error. But there needs to be a way for the investigator to define the research problem. And then from that, they formulate questions and a theoretical framework that might be used in order to dive down and understand a particular problem. And you might have various levels or tiers that you want to identify. So level 1, 2, 3, or 4, or topic 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the idea is the investigator would come up with formulate questions that would then try to tease out more information from that population on those various tiers or that various theoretical framework. Now, it's also important that the investigator understands how best to collect the data. And with qualitative research, it's important to have training of the individuals who might be conducting the focus groups or doing the interviews. And there might be some pilot work that will be necessary in order to work out any of the details or issues in terms of the right questions to ask or how to ask the questions, which could or may not influence the answers. Selection of participants. What kind of participants will the investigator seek to answer the question that they're trying to get at? And also identifying and entering the setting. So it's very important that the setting that the individuals that are participating will be important, because the fact that they need to feel that they will be heard, the acoustics will be effective, such as let's say it might be over the internet through some type of Snapchat or anything like that. But the idea is that it's important for the individuals and that they feel that their voice is being heard and that their time is not being wasted. So when you're collecting data in qualitative research, it's important that the investigators and those helping them are trained in order to ask questions and listen appropriately, and that you select the participants effectively so you can get at the questions you're trying to get. And also identifying the setting. The setting is really, really important. You want to make sure that they feel relaxed and that they feel that they can answer or respond honestly. So the last thing is the sorting and analyzing of the data. In fact, in qualitative research, sorting and analyzing data, because you're not working directly with numbers as you would in quantitative data, can be very time consuming. The investigator will have to sort through the various themes, the questions that might be coming through in the interview or the focus group, and they have to be able to sort that in such a way that then they can make sense of it. And so in some ways, qualitative research can be much more time demanding in terms of sorting and especially analyzing the data compared to quantitative data when you're working with numbers. But again, the advantage of qualitative research is you get some potentially more in-depth information from a population. Now, a little bit more detail about sorting and analyzing qualitative data. one important thing to keep in mind is that this occurs during and after data collection. So while you're collecting data, it's important for the investigator to um, sort, analyze, look at some of the questions or the answers or responses that are coming through an interview or a focus group to ensure that there potentially are new themes as opposed to the same theme over and over in order to reduce the amount of extra work that might be upon the investigator. So it's important to kind of keep up with the data, qualitative data that's coming in. So now the first step in analyzing qualitative data is by transcribing interviews and transferring field notes to another medium so they can be analyzed. This is very important. So because at some point the investigator needs to understand what they've found. So there are some different techniques that are available for sorting through data. The old method was to keep index cards and develop themes where you write down an index card and then you would sort the card based on the theme that came through. Now, a more preferable method is using computer programs such as in vivo that allow you to electronically underline or highlight particular text or words based on a predetermined scale or that you will be using to identify those themes. And there's a coding tree, which I'll get to in a moment, that discusses how best to go about doing that process. So again, these are some of the information things that you should be aware of. So again, just back to the top here, again, making sure that you're more efficient in terms of your interviewing process, avoiding that term called saturation when you over and over you are now getting the same responses. You want to be very important or very efficient in what you're doing. Again, and also the different techniques on how to sort through this data. So during data analysis, a researcher attempts to merge data into a holistic portrayal of a phenomenon in order to provide some kind of meaning to what they have gathered. Now, researchers assign meaning to data using analytical narrative. So this really is a brief interpretation that provides a description of the meaning to the data. So again, it provides some kind of meaning, and it's in a brief interpretation by the investigator to what the individuals may have said or done. Another aspect is you have a narrative vignette, which is more of a detailed explanation in how the participants felt or what they said or what they did during the phenomenon. This provides some meaning to the data. And they can do this using quotes or examples to support conclusion. So they may highlight a particular quote or provide some examples that were made by the participants. But all of these are ways to sort and analyze the qualitative data so it can be interpreted. So the other aspect is that researchers often use content or thematic analysis when analyzing data. So for example, researchers independently read and reread the transcripts of the interviews or focus groups and identify recurring themes. They would write these themes down, they would record these themes, and then the researchers would discuss the themes together and relevant quotes until consensus is reached. So this is where compromise would be needed. And then using a coding tree of some sort, they would then, an individual, once all of this information was transcribed, an individual would have to go back to those transcriptions in order to then underline or identify the quotes, the points of view that were made to support each of these levels of themes that were made. It can be a very tedious process. It can take a lot of time, but once completed, you'd have a really rich set of data that can be used to analyze and interpret a particular phenomenon. So by having this in-depth information, it'll allow you to make some interpretations that you may not be able to make with quantitative research. And that will go to my next point, a myth about only the truth is in numbers. So we'll get to that in just a moment. So for example, when we're talking about qualitative data, all qualitative data can be coded numerically. And it's common to report frequencies and percentages of these themes. So as we talked about previously, when you collect qualitative data, you might develop themes, things that come up frequently, and then you code them, give them a number, 1, 2, 3, and then through a set of statistical analyses that we won't cover in this course, you're able to then determine the outcome or what it means. Now, all quantitative data are based on qualitative judgment. So, for example, in body mass index, you can take insurance agents or insurencers have determined that body mass index through a series of analysis have determined that body mass index can lead, a high body mass index can lead to diseases. And this was then quantified later on using experimental research. And sometimes, though, you might rely on quantifiable data, such as attitudes, that can then be used for qualitative judgment. So the point of this is that quantitative data are based on qualitative judgment. But again, some of these have to be determined by the investigator, or in some cases, like we talked about, the insurer. So again, just to reiterate, in this particular case, where the body mass index was first elaborated or determined by using qualitative data, they were then, over time, were able to make quantitative measures and determinations through formulas, etc., about who to insure, what not to insure, etc. So this just, again, is how the link really between qualitative data and quantitative data and how they can be used to determine or make decisions. Now, something to think about is that, using qualitative data to make decisions can lead to poor decisions. For example, imagine if you just use quantitative data to choose your major based on the amount of salary. Well, most people would pick medicine or engineering, etc. Well, what if employers just used a survey to determine maybe the person's GPA and just use GPA without interviewing the individual, using qualitative data through an interview? Or what about using a standardized test to choose your life partner? If a standardized test said that you weren't compatible, however, you might in your relationship determine that the person was the right person. Again, here's an example of using a standardized test of quantitative data that may not give you the whole picture. What about pain? Pain can be measured quantitatively, but also qualitatively in terms of how it might actually feel, your response to it, and it can vary from person to person. So you need to have how the person would describe that type of pain. And pain can also vary. The types of pain vary. And what about how does someone choose a physical activity program to participate in? Would they simply do it based on the quantitative measures? Or there might be other qualities that the physical activity program might be appeasing. For example, choosing, let's say, one type of exercise, swimming versus running, for example. One might say that one might be better than the other quantitatively in terms of the health benefits, but there might be other things that the individual might enjoy that might lead that individual to stick with it and therefore have long-term benefits. So again, there's some advantages of using qualitative data beyond simple quantitative data to make decisions. So there are some potential issues in qualitative research, such as ethical and is also if it's conducted competently. So when you're working with qualitative research, there are situations where you may end up getting sensitive information or items that should be private. So the individual collecting the data needs to be ethical and also needs to be conducted competently. There might be, in qualitative research, the opportunity to have a lot of contact between the investigator and the participants, which could bias the sample. So that the investigator needs to be aware of how their interactions may affect the outcomes with the participants. So when conducting research competently, you need to have some credibility. So the results need to be believable from the perspective of the participant. One way to ensure this is to have the participant review the notes that were taken to ensure that the researcher captured the essence of what the person was trying to say. Another aspect is transferability. So this is really the degree which results can be transferred to other contexts or settings. And this can be ensured by the way in which the participants are recruited to ensure that they are representative of the population that the results are supposed to be generalizable to. So another aspect of qualitative research is dependability or reliability. And the investigator needs to account for the changing context within which research occurs. So they need to make sure that the environment and the situation in which data is collected is dependable and reliable from one participant to the next, to ensure that the way in which questions were asked and that by whom it was asked are the similar from one person to the next. The final is to be if the research can be confirmed by other researchers. And so this is going to be key, that the research methods are done and explained in such a way that other researchers can replicate and confirm the results that the individual received. So all of these issues in qualitative research should be aware of. So is it conducted ethically and also conducted competently? Now here's two examples of qualitative research in kinesiology that you can use to identify ways to identify qualitative research. On the left, we have some keywords called perspectives. So that is one way to identify qualitative research, and also in the abstract when it talks about quantitative studies. And also, again, the word perspectives. On the right, it is more explicit when it talks about a qualitative study, and also the use of some qualitative data analysis and collection. So these are some clues in which to identify things or studies that are qualitative in nature. So here is continuing the example within the introduction of ways to identify if it's qualitative in nature. Again, looking for keywords such as interview, using a formative process. Again, here using focus groups. In both of these studies, it indicates, again, surveys, it indicates clues by which that this is quantitative in nature, and then as opposed to quantitative. So when you're looking through research, make sure if you start to look things and you notice that there was a lot of use of interviews or potential surveys and focus groups, that would be a key indication that it could potentially be a quantitative or a qualitative study. Now, here's kind of like the example of a life cycle of a research problem. So you begin with a quantitative research that could indicate a high prevalence of health complications in population. For example, the Pima Indians have about 50% of their population is considered obese. Now, through this process of observation and qualitative research, there are interviews from the investigator to the Pima Indians to better understand what factors may contribute to the poor health and or lifestyle behaviors in this population, in our case, the Pima Indians. But what happened over time is these Pima Indians adopted the Western lifestyle, and they started eating poor diets and lack of physical activity, and that contributed to their obesity epidemic. So what happened with the Pima Indians, we had some groups that actually continued with the traditional diets of the Pima Indians. And again, the other half uh, in Arizona adopted the Western habits, Western and United States habits of poor diet and lack of physical activity. And through this, the researchers developed quantitative research study to determine whether perceptions obtained from interviews are prevalent within the population. So they interviewed both those Pima Indians in Arizona and also those that were in Mexico following the traditional Pima Indian culture. And what they found was there was a difference in perception about physical activity and proper diet in those living in the United States and Arizona versus those living in Mexico. And you can believe it or not, the Pima Indians in Arizona had a high rate of obesity and disease, such as diabetes and heart disease, where those in Mexico who had continued with the traditional increased physical activity and healthy diet, it was almost non-existent health disease. So what happened was the investigators, through this quantitative research and interviews, or excuse me, through this qualitative research, is they started to develop quantitative type of research to answer questions about why is there really a difference between the one Pima Indian populations, those living in Arizona versus those living in Mexico. So the point of this is that it shows the evolution of the cycle of how a research question might begin qualitatively, where you start to build up various data qualitatively in depth through interviews or focus groups, and then key questions start to come up, and then they're measurable quantitatively, and then you can see how they end up, and then you have a more concrete way of identifying the reasons as which there might be differences, in this case, between populations, or there might be a way quantitatively to answer a research question. But the idea started qualitatively. Now, there are times where you combine quantitative and qualitative methods in a research study. And the idea behind this is an investigator may want to find quantitatively the effects of a particular intervention on particular outcomes, such as health, but they may also want to measure qualitatively what the individuals felt about the intervention. In this particular case, you would need someone potentially that has expertise in quantitative and another investigator that might have an expertise in qualitative research. But in health sciences, it's important to gather not only if a particular intervention is effective, but also understanding why it is effective. Because then you're able to hopefully implement that to a larger population, and more importantly, the person will stick with it. And so having understanding that, yes, the intervention works, but we need to understand the why it works. So in the health sciences, an example of personal trainers working with clients may want to not only determine how the client is moving or progressing numerically, but also they may want to find out, why are they enjoying the training. In all aspects of health sciences, regardless of the field that you're going into, it's going to be important to understand the why an individual, if they like what they're doing or not like what they're doing. For example, you may be working with someone who over time may plateau in terms of their progression. It will be important to go beyond just the numbers, but to ask them why. They may be having something going on in their personal life, they may be not feeling well, or they may not enjoy the protocol that they're on. So it's doubtful that a personal trainer or a health professional will just simply look at numbers, but they're going to want to know the meaning and the why behind those numbers. Data collection for mixed method research could be performed at the same time, sometimes called parallel or concurrent mixed methods, and independently from each other. So for example, when you do an evaluation, a course evaluation of a instructor, You will both do a numerical, filling out a Likert scale, but also provide qualitative data as well. Now, in this case, the qualitative data may be used to quantify the progression in terms of plotting how that person has improved or not improved their teaching. But there's also qualitative data that can be used to determine why that individual is getting the ratings that they're doing or not. So using these both qualitative and quantitative at the same time can be effective, again, providing some meaning to the numerical and quantitative numbers. Another part of mixed methods research is when quantitative data is collected first, then qualitative data, and this sometimes is called sequential mixed methods, where one is done first followed by the other, or it could be vice versa. So for example, you may collect a certain amount of data, and then you then will follow up with interviews to determine maybe the why or how, why they felt the way they did. Or the reverse is where you have a qualitative research and then followed by quantitative, such as an example of the Pima Indians, where there was some qualitative analysis, interviews, focus groups, and then specific questions were developed and then investigated, the quantitative version. But again, this is sequential, was one method followed by the other method. But either way, as mentioned previously, it does require multiple expertise. You usually need a good research investigator will have a team with similar research interests but different approaches to completing research. So for example, in this department, you might have individuals that have a strong qualitative background and those that have a strong quantitative. And they could work together in collaboration on various studies. So this is just the end of lesson number 4, an overview of qualitative research. Make sure you review the information prior to taking the quiz.